Hi everybody, welcome to the Parallel Systems broadcast. I'm your host Mike. Thank you for tuning in to another episode. Today's episode is extremely important because it's all about Russia's plan that they've recently announced to go back to using gold to back their currency. Now, this is not going to be done in the traditional way, as I'm going to explain during today's episode. In fact, we don't know quite how they're going to do it, but we do have some ideas. And the reason we have these ideas is because Sergei Glaziev, who is one of Russia's top economists and a key architect of the new BRICS monetary system, has written this article here called Golden Ruble 3.0. Now, this is absolutely fascinating. It's going to have profound consequences for the global monetary system. I'm talking specifically the dollar system. This is going to lead to the collapse of the US dollar if it is enacted. And I also think it's going to have huge consequences in terms of the price of gold. So we're going to talk about what those consequences are towards the end of the show. So stick around for that. But first and foremost, let's just have a look at this article here. I've had to highlight most of it because it's so fascinating. So I would highly recommend that you go and read this article yourself. It's extremely hard to find Sergei Glaziev's work in the West for obvious reasons. However, I will leave the link to this Russian article here in the description, and you can translate that using Google Translate and read his own words, but I will explain it to you also. So he starts by talking about how the process of de-dollarization is now well underway. Now, this of course began with countries like China and Russia, who have significantly reduced their dollar reserves. They've been reducing their dollar reserves and also over the past 20 years rapidly increasing their gold holdings. Now, the reason for this is because the dollar system is simply designed to enable the US to continue to enact its hegemony. It is a weapon. The US dollar is a weapon. Now, the reason for that is because the US can print the dollar. They can print that dollar to oblivion, and other countries are forced to hold that dollar. So just think about that for a second. Other countries are forced to hold something that the owner of that can devalue at any time. Now, not only this, the person who is printing the dollar, the US, they can take their paper that is worthless, force it upon other countries, and then those other countries have to give something of value back. So they can take this paper, print it up, and go out and buy real things with it. Also, they can actually confiscate other countries' reserves of currency. They have the power to do that because they also have military might, and that's exactly what happened against Russia. And finally, they can block other countries from using the global financial system. I'm talking here about SWIFT for international payments. They can actually exclude a country from that. So that's what's happening to Russia now. It's total financial warfare. It's designed to destroy Russia financially so that the US can then come in militarily and destroy what's left of Russia. That is the plan. But of course, countries do not want to be a part of a system like this, and it's not just Russia now. There is a whole host of countries seeking to exit the dollar. So that is why Sergei Glaziev says the de-dollarization process is well underway, and it's encompassing way more countries than I think the US ever anticipated it would be. We're even seeing allies like Saudi Arabia begin to make deals with China to accept yuan. And that is what he says next. He says that the share of settlements in soft currencies is growing. In September, Russia became the third country in the world in terms of the use of the yuan, that's the Chinese yuan, in international payment. He goes on to say that the central bank in recent months has been using yuan trading accounts for up to 26% of foreign exchange transactions in the Russian Federation. And the yuan-ruble pair on the Moscow exchange has more than once overtaken the dollar and euro in terms of daily trading volume. So Sergei Glaziev goes on to say that all of these countries are now collecting soft currencies, and this will only increase in the future. Now, what that means is that when they're trading with one another outside the dollar, they start to accumulate the currency of the other country because they're accepting each other's national currencies as payment for commodities rather than the dollar. So for example, Russia will say to India, you can buy our oil and you can give us rupees and we'll keep your rupees. And then India will say, fantastic, if you deal with us, we'll accept your rubles. Now that's great, but that system is awfully convoluted because you end up collecting lots of different random currencies that you don't need. Then you're going to have to exchange those currencies in the Forex markets for currencies that you want to buy other things. The other problem with it is it's open to gross manipulation by the US. Remember, the US can just print dollars, then use those dollars to manipulate other currencies. They can buy or sell other currencies in the Forex market to manipulate the price of them. So the US can easily sabotage this system and make it very, very difficult to use national currencies. Similarly, they can also put sanctions on other countries that will also make it more difficult for them to use each other's national currencies. So really that is just step one. Using national currencies, it's a very clunky and convoluted system. It helps you on the path to de-dollarization, but you then have to move beyond it. And that is exactly what Sergei Glaziev says is coming next. He says it becomes necessary to sterilize their excess mass, which is an interesting way of putting it, but this is translated. And he says the best way to do this is for countries to start buying gold and using that gold to price commodities in. And that's where it's going to. It's going to price commodities in gold and then transacting in gold for commodities. So like I said, this will be an absolute nuclear bomb on the dollar system. In fact, this is the final piece, in my opinion. Once this is in place, you essentially have two separate systems in play. You have the gold system of the BRICS nations and the fiat system of the West. So it will bring down that fiat system. And in the West, it's going to be essentially like Gresham's law. The bad money is going to drive out the good. And what I mean by that is all of the countries of the West that have gold are going to have to start using it to transact, to get commodities, to get the things they need, because all of these nations of the BRICS and the BRICS Plus, they're no longer going to accept the fiat currencies because they have no use for it anymore. They have no use for the dollar. So they're going to say, right, if you want to buy our real things, you have to put up something that is real, something of value, something that cannot be printed. And of course, that's gold. That is exactly what they're planning to do. So this is going to destroy the dollar system. That is going to be a huge year for us all. Then in 2023, we're going to get to see this start to unravel before our very eyes. So Sergei Glaziev goes on to say that Russia's transition to using these national currencies is a good tactical decision, but it's not a strategic one, because if they continue to price commodities in dollars and they keep using Western exchanges and the trade flows have to be ensured by British companies, then they are not really decoupling from the Western distorting mirror, as he calls it, or the derivatives pricing system. So what he means there is that these countries of the East, Russia, the BRICS nations, they're trying to get out of the Western system. So it's no good just to use national currencies, like I've already said. You have to escape the system entirely, because remember, everybody knows that the pyramid system is coming down. These debt pyramids are going to implode. The derivatives, 2 to 4 quadrillion of them, are going to come collapsing down. And they need to get out of that. They need to escape that. Now, you can't escape that if you're still using the financial infrastructure of the West. It's open to abuse by Western nations. And also, you're still a part of that system, so that when it comes down, you're going to have your capital trapped in it also. So there's many risks there. So Sergei Glaziev goes on to say about how they could fix the price of commodities in gold. And he uses oil as an example. And he says we could fix the price of oil in gold at the level of 2 barrels for 1 gram of gold. Now, of course, this would lead to an increase in the price of gold. It would simply double it straight to $3,000 per ounce. And this was something that was already discussed by Credit Suisse analyst Zoltan Pozsar. He says that this would be an adequate response to the price ceilings introduced by the West, because it would put a floor under the value of the commodity, in this case oil. So right there and then, it's exactly what I've been predicting on this channel, a revaluation of gold. However, I think that would just be the beginning. That would be a revaluation whilst the old system still exists. However, once the old system no longer exists, then you would have a true revaluation to account for the real price of the commodities on planet Earth. And that would be far, far higher than what we've got now. Of course, they would have to revalue it in the West so that they could have enough capital in the central banks to actually trade with other countries. So again, remember, this is coming from one of Russia's top economists and somebody who is actually designing the new monetary system. So if he is actually saying that this is something they could do, that means they are talking about doing it right now. And I think they're going to do it. Everything that Sergei Glaziev has predicted thus far in terms of the new monetary system has so far come true. So I don't doubt that this will happen. He goes on to say that gold, along with silver, has been the core of the global financial system for millennia, an equivalent and honest measure of the value of paper money and assets. And he goes on to talk about how gold became anachronistic. It was cancelled by the US in 1971 when they ended Bretton Woods. But remember, this is something I talked about in a recent interview. The reason why gold was taken out of the system was not because gold is no good and it's useless and it's past its day. The reason it was taken out is because the US wanted something that it had complete control over, that no other country could have as a reserve asset without their say-so. And of course, that was the US dollar, the petrodollar. So they didn't want gold to be part of the system because other countries can transact in gold outside of the US's say-so. That's exactly why they're going to go back to using gold now in the East, because it cannot be printed and it cannot be controlled. So that is why they want to use it. And that is why the US is terrified of people using gold to transact. And of course, that's why they manipulated the price for the past 52 years to ensure that people didn't turn to gold and say, wait a minute, why aren't we using that thing that's going up in value? Why are we using these pieces of paper that only go down in value? So it was absolutely vital that they manipulated the price of the gold so it went down rather than up. Now, of course, it's gone up massively since the 1970s. It's gone from $35 per ounce to around $1,800 an ounce. That's an astronomical gain, or an astronomical devaluation in the price of the paper we use to value it in, whichever way you want to look at it. However, as we move forward, the US is going to lose control of the gold price because the East are going to start using it to transact in commodities. And like I said, I think at that point, those countries are also going to say, well, wait a minute, we're getting real stuff now for our commodities. Why are we going to accept that paper from these other countries in the West? We're getting real gold over here that's got true value, or we could accept that money over there that they're printing and has zero intrinsic value. Which would you take? I know which one I would take. So that's exactly what's going to happen, and it's going to rapidly escalate the speed at which the current Western financial system collapses. In fact, this could be the straw that finally breaks the camel's back. So we have to be ready for this in 2023. I'm not sure how quickly this is going to come into being, but I think at some point next year we start to see gold back in the financial system in a way similar to the ones that Sergei Glaziev is suggesting here. And Sergei Glaziev hits the nail on the head here when he says that Russia, together with its eastern and southern partners, have a unique chance to jump off the sinking ship of the dollar-centric debt economy, ensuring its own development and mutual trade in the accumulated and extracted strategic resources, meaning their commodities. And that's exactly what he and these other countries want to do. They want to get off the sinking ship, create their own lifeboat. And I've got to tell you, everyone, I think they're very, very close now to achieving this. Now, of course, this is not going to come without significant backlash from the US. As you all know, there is a war taking place in Ukraine. That war is against, of course, Russia. Russia are the key architects of the new system. They're the ones that are now driving this forward. So, of course, we're going to see an escalation in the war because of this very reason. Because the US will do whatever it takes to try and stop these countries from leaving the dollar system. The US needs to maintain its hegemony and its control. That's what it wants to do. That's what it's trying to do. So war will escalate. The US will increase the physical side of the war if they have to try and stop this. Also, of course, we'll see more financial warfare enacted not just towards Russia, but also to all of the other nations that get involved in extricating themselves from the US dollar. So this is why 2023 is going to be a huge year, and we have to be ready for all that might occur. Now, why does Sergei Glaziev call it the golden ruble 3.0 and not 1.0? Well, that's because historically there has been a number of times in the past when Russia has pegged a ruble to gold. It's not the first time, and he goes through a little trip down memory lane to remind us of this. He says that there was a gold standard in the 19th century under the Rothschilds, who, remember, had control over all of European banking. And the Rothschilds, through gold loans, managed to subordinate continental Europe to the British financial system. So what they were doing back then was they was lending gold to countries at interest, and of course that enabled them to get power over that country, and that's what happened all across Europe. So that was the golden ruble 1.0, and it ensured the process of capitalist accumulation whilst also tying domestic bankers and industrialists to sources of Western capital. So that is how central banking worked. That is how private banking worked. They went to countries, they got them indebted, and once you was indebted to someone like the Rothschilds, then they could engineer all kinds of problems for your country and force you to give up parts of your industry, to install political puppets that were subservient to them. That is exactly how it worked. And he says there was no large-scale gold mining in Russia at the time. The industry only appeared under Stalin. So that meant there was no way Russia could mine its own gold. They had to lend it from the Western bankers, the Rothschilds, the Warburgs, and that's how they ended up getting indebted to these banksters. He goes on to say that gold also played an important role during the industrialization and the post-war period, particularly after the USSR refused to join the dollar standard at the time, and they also started to accumulate at that point gold reserves. Then Sergei goes on to mention how Khrushchev abolished the ruble's peg to gold, having carried out a monetary reform in 1961, which was a devaluation, and he created the conditions for the subsequent transformation of the country into a raw material appendage of the Western financial system. So that was Russia essentially becoming the commodity producer for the West, and that happened under Khrushchev. And he says now the conditions for the golden ruble 3.0 have objectively developed. And he talks about how the sanctions against Russia have actually boomeranged back on the Western economy. Yes, this is the sanctions the US put on Russia. They expected Russia to crumble immediately, but Russia was prepared for it. And one of the reasons for that is because of this man here, Sergei Glaziev. He understood back in 2014 that there was going to be a war in Ukraine, and he started preparing Russia for it all the way back then. He started preparing for the sanctions that he knew would come. And he wrote about this in his 2014 book called The Last War. He wrote all about it. He predicted the war in Ukraine. He said exactly how it was going to happen. And he spoke also about the financial consequences of that, and also about how they were going to seek to de-dollarize as quickly as possible to try and stop those consequences. So Russia was ready for this. He goes on to say how we now have massive geopolitical instability provoked by them. I think he's meaning the West in this instance. He says rising prices for energy carriers and other resources, inflation, and many other negative factors that have put a strong pressure on the global economy, particularly the global financial market. Now he makes his own little prediction here for 2023. He says that all of these circumstances will objectively affect the change in the stereotypes of investment policy in the world. Now listen to what he says here. He talks here about the shift back to real assets. He says people are going to move from risky investments in complex financial instruments to investing in traditional assets, primarily gold. So you can already imagine the profound impact all of this collectively is going to have on the gold price. Of course, I've been telling you about this on the channel for a long time, but now you're hearing it from somebody who's right at the top of the food chain there in terms of manufacturing and creating the new financial system that we're going to see in the East, and perhaps eventually in the West also, as they are forced to try and emulate something like the Eastern system so that they too can survive in the coming crisis after the financial debt pyramids have collapsed. He goes on to say that according to Saxo Bank analysts, in 2023, increased demand for gold will lead to the price rising from $1,800 per ounce to $3,000 per ounce. He's predicting that. So what we're going to see is that the people who were prepared and positioned for what is about to come, the people that understood that we had this massive debt pyramid that was about to collapse and started to take themselves out of that system and put themselves into real hard assets, and we're talking specifically here about gold, those people will not only survive, they will be rewarded for taking action. And of course, this is something that I've been telling people about on this channel. I don't tell people what to do, but I do tell them what is happening in the global financial system. And I've tried my best to warn people that if you have your money in this old system, this debt pyramid system, if you are still in that, if you hold paper assets, it's gonna go to zero. You're gonna be bailed in with the banks. They're setting you up to be the fall guy, so you have to get out of it. Also, I've told you what history tells us is the best place to be. And I've also forewarned you about how gold is going to be put straight back into the monetary system, and therefore it's going to have to be revalued, not just once, but time and time again. And then Sergey talks about how large gold reserves allow countries to pursue a sovereign financial policy, minimizing the dependence on external creditors. And that is exactly what these countries are looking for now. It's also the same for the individual. The more gold reserves that you have as an individual, the more you can pursue a sovereign life. I'm talking about not being controlled, not being forced into a new system of central bank digital currencies, digital ID, some QR code because you can't afford food because the system's collapsed and your money in the bank has been stolen off you in a bank bail-in, or it's just hyperinflated and now you've got to use their scheme or scam to go get food. That is why you need to be sovereign. The same way that these countries are trying to be sovereign through gold, you can do the same for you and your family with precious metals. And of course, there are other hard assets too. And I also talk about physical preparation here on this channel, about getting yourself a food garden, having some off-grid energy. When everyone else is being forced into some QR code electronic concentration camp, you'll be able to opt out because you won't be 100% dependent on the state like everybody else is, because you'll have taken your money out of the system. So as these countries are doing this, you should mimic them too in your own life. You should do what they're doing. They're starting to become almost like the prepper nations of the world. They're taking themselves out of the fiat Ponzi scheme. You should be doing the same. The warning signs are all around us, and we're hearing it from people like Sergey Glaziev. So it's up to you. Who do you believe? Do you believe the old fiat Ponzi system? Do you believe that's going to go on forever? Do you believe that the inflation is going to stop? Or do you see what's really happening? Because if you do, now's the time to act. And he goes on in this section just to talk a little bit about how central banks have been accumulating gold at a record pace, buying 400 tons of gold in the third quarter of this year. He also mentions how the volume of annual gold production is estimated at only 200 billion per year, the volume of accumulated reserves at 7 trillion, of which the central banks have no more than a fifth. And in the third quarter, they bought a record 400 tons of gold. And he also mentions how the People's Bank of China announced for the first time in many years that they are building up their gold reserves too. Now, of course, China's been doing that anyways. We know they've secretly been building up their gold reserves for many, many years. Some people believe they now have over 30,000 tons. Now, Sergey Glaziev goes on to mention how China not only have huge reserves themselves, but their people, the people of China, also have 23,000 tons at least of gold stored up. So collectively, you're talking well over 50,000, maybe even 60,000 tons of gold in China. The same in India. In India, there is more than 50,000 tons in private hands. This is how citizens in India save their money. Now, of course, India have tried many times to wrestle that gold from their own populace. They know how much gold the citizens have, and they are desperate to get their greedy, grubby hands on it. They've done things like gold bonds, where citizens are told, if you give us your gold holdings, then we'll give you some bonds and we'll pay you back the gold in 10 years, we promise. However, the citizens are extremely wise over there. They've seen it all before, and they are not going to give up their gold to the state. So that is India for you. And of course, we've also seen lots of gold flow from west to east over the last quarter of a century. And Sergey Glaziev mentions how there has been 2,000 to 3,000 tons per year going from west to east. And he says, has the despicable metal remained in the vaults of the Western banks at all? Or is it fully demonetized through swaps and leasings? The West will never admit it, and there will be no audit of Fort Knox. So what he's suggesting here is that perhaps the West doesn't even have any gold left. So just imagine the East have got this system coming to life that is going to be built around gold. What if the West really don't even have anywhere close to that amount of gold? Maybe that is why the US is so desperate to bring down the current system, because they know it's not only going to end their hegemony, it may actually knock them not just off top spot, but all the way down to 10th, 15th or 20th. Maybe it's going to leave them like the post-Soviet empire, where people can barely afford to feed and clothe themselves. Now, of course, the US has lots of resources. The US has lots of commodities, but so did Russia when the Soviet Empire collapsed and thousands of people starved to death. Alcoholism and drug use skyrocketed. That is exactly what we're seeing in the US right now. If you look at these videos coming out of major cities, they are full of people that live on the streets and spend all their lives just taking drugs. So we're starting to see some parallels on the fringes of US society. We're also seeing US society become increasingly angry and violent towards one another. So I think the signs are there. We're seeing the decay of the monetary system, but we're also seeing the social and moral decay too. And that's because all of this is linked together. Okay, and Sergey Glaziev ends on a huge bombshell here, and I'll read it out to you. He says, gold mining, which today barely occupies 1% of GDP, may well grow to 2 to 3% of GDP, and it may become the basis for the rapid growth of the entire commodity sector and the balancing of foreign trade, which is still based on the tyranny of the issuers of hard currencies and the risks of devaluation and insufficient convertibility of soft currencies. And he goes on to say, in this case, Russia, due to a well-organized global gold rush and the population of Russia following the world's central banks, have already increased investment in gold by 4 times compared to the last year. So that's Russian citizens have increased their own holdings of gold as well. And he says that Russia will be able to increase its gold production from 330 tons by 1.5 times to 500 tons, becoming the world leader in the strategic industry of gold mining. We will also get a bonus of a strong ruble. So there's so much to talk about there. There's so much to unpack. Not only is Sergey Glaziev talking about gold becoming the new de facto reserve asset, and I'm talking about whilst they build their new system, they're going to go back to using gold as the international reserve. He's also talking about pricing commodities in gold too. So this is going to have profound consequences on the entire globe. It's going to completely change how people see gold. Remember, in the West, the US has been pumping out anti-gold propaganda for over 52 years, manipulating the price purely so that they can continue to use their fiat dollar and force it upon people and try to maintain some belief that the dollar is actually something of value. And of course, gold is the metric against which everything else is valued. So when the price of gold goes up in a currency, people know that that currency is being devalued vis-a-vis gold, because gold is real. It's a hard asset. So you can measure the value of other things in it. The dollar, on the other hand, is a soft asset, as Sergey Glaziev says. It's a soft currency and its value diminishes. So what do I think the consequences of all of this are going to be? Well, I can tell you they're going to be big. First and foremost, the US is going to do everything in their power to try and stop this from coming into being. Of course, they can't stop it because all of these countries are already doing this. They're already starting to use each other's national currencies. The US cannot stop them going to using gold. However, what the US can do is enact a hybrid war against these countries, as it is already doing against Russia. This is the problem with having a financial system that is based on one country's national currency. Everything can be manipulated. Everything can be corrupted. Similarly, we have a gold market that is controlled by paper contracts. So that means somebody can go in there and put bids in for contracts of gold that far outstrip the actual global supply of gold that is on the market. Somebody can put in contracts for gold that doesn't even exist, and they regularly do. They regularly put in big contracts and then cancel the contracts, or the contracts are never fulfilled, or they short gold. They can manipulate the price as much as they want through these paper contracts, because the paper contracts can be leveraged. So the gold doesn't even have to exist. It's just pieces of paper, debt instruments that are passing back and forward between one another. Then they wrap them up in derivatives and give them to other people too. So you've got these bundles of derivatives that are being traded, and those derivatives are just toxic debt for the most part. So this is what's happening right now globally. This is how they're managing the gold price, and of course it's how they've managed the economy globally for many, many years. And we're starting to see that unravel now. We're starting to see those derivatives fall apart. We saw this with the LDI crisis in Great Britain, but I guarantee there's going to be more this year. Now, how effective is manipulating the price of gold through the paper markets going to be when the East and the BRICS nations start to price commodities in gold? I'll tell you, not very effective at all, because the paper price will be completely decoupled from the real price, and countries are going to have to put up at the real price to get commodities, not at the fake paper price. So this is going to destroy the paper markets as well. So I think we've got some really exciting and interesting times ahead for people that are protecting their wealth in gold and for people that invest in silver and gold miners too. And this is something that I foresaw a long time ago, and that's why I've always spoke about gold on this channel, because I understood that it was gold that was the metal that was going to be used in the new monetary system. Now that doesn't mean silver won't see a giant boost in price too. However, it's not going to be the same because silver is not the metal that is being used by central banks. So it's important to understand that. Do I think silver will go up with it? Of course I do. They always move together, but I do think gold is the most important space to be looking at. Gold miners too could see a substantial increase in value and price. However, remember, if the pyramid debt system does come down, all of those companies that you're buying stocks and shares in will be a part of that system too. All of your contracts will be tied up in that system. And as the markets plummet, the value of those companies, on paper at least, could plummet too. And that's because the whole market will sell off in a crash. And of course, we don't know where that will lead to. It could freeze up the markets. You may not even be able to buy and sell positions. So you have to think at all times, counterparties, and also de-risking yourself in other ways. It doesn't mean you don't go into those spaces, doesn't mean you don't hold those companies, but it does mean you have to have some protection in real assets. We're living through some profound changes, and it's all going to happen very quickly. So congratulations if you have already figured this one out, if you've already took those steps to start protecting you and your family from the coming financial collapse. If you have already started to invest in the precious metals, I think you are going to be very handsomely rewarded, and the things that I have been predicting on this channel are starting to come true. So that's it for today's show, everyone. I hope you found that interesting. I hope it put a smile on your face going into 2023. If you would like to access more of my research and knowledge, please check me out on Patreon, where you can connect with me privately. You can also find out more about my investing theses, my philosophy on investing, how I go about investing in things like commodities and equities. These are things that I'm interested in also, particularly gold and silver miners. Also, we have a Telegram group over there, and I also produce a newsletter, an Audible newsletter, where I discuss investing philosophy, but we also talk about getting prepared practically for the coming crisis. I'm talking about in terms of your personal security, food security, water, energy, all of these things that are going to be so important for ensuring that we survive the coming decade of crisis. Of course, we also talk about the financial side of things in more detail too. And if you like, you can also consult with me on your own investments and how you can better prepare yourself for the coming crisis, and also things like what we spoke about today, the revaluation in gold. How do you put together a portfolio that gives you access to some speculative areas such as equities, whilst also protecting your wealth in real hard assets? What are the proportions that you should be looking at? How can you invest in equities most safely and securely when we have the risk of a debt collapse and potentially the freezing up of the financial system? Is it even possible? Well, these are things that I am putting lots of work and thought into in my own life, and of course I help other people with it too. So you can get in touch with me if you would like to consult me on that, or you can join my Patreon and go to the higher tiers where I actually do one-to-one discussions over Zoom with my patrons. Now, of course, I can't leave 2023 without saying a big thank you to my existing patrons. Thank you so much for supporting me and the channel. And of course, thank you to anybody else who has shared my videos and content with their friends and family. I really appreciate it. The channel is growing. And of course, my goal is to share this message with as many people as possible to protect and help ensure as many people as possible make it through to the other side, so that we can build a better system than the totalitarian one that they are trying to funnel us all into. Thank you so much for watching, and of course I will see you in the next one, which will be in the new year. Have a fantastic time, and I'll see you there.